So what I want to do is talk a little bit about why I have gotten so interested in the body as a portal, or as an entry into what it is that we're doing in Zen training. I want to talk about my history with how I got started in Zen training, and then how it evolved into the kinds of explorations that I do today professionally with body therapeutic work, trauma therapeutic work as well. And what I'm learning from the contemporary work that I do in the therapeutic realm, what that's informing about my approach to my own Zen practice, working with beginners. So let's start with the title of the talk, Soma. So the word itself simply means body in Greek. But I probably could have titled this talk Body, but I chose Soma for a particular reason, because it by being a word that we don't use a lot, it allows us to evoke maybe a different kind of quality or meaning out of it. And in the contemporary use of the word soma, or the adjective form somatic, what we are trying to get at is a sense of what does it mean to be living inside of a body like one of these. Having a body like one of these, or a nervous system. Now, there is a tendency in Western culture, particularly more modern Western culture, where we really conceive of kind of a split between mind and body. And a pretty common way to experience ourselves or experience our bodies rather, is that we have a body, and it's useful, it gets us around, it digests foods, it sustains us with energy, but that its function is fairly utilitarian, and it's a platform or a vehicle for sustaining this other thing that we consider ourselves, which, and popularly conceived, would be kind of like the self and the brain. And what somatic work does in general is it challenges the notion that self and thinking and who I am and that mind is so separate from the body. And it starts to explore the body from a point of view of not the framework of I have a body, but I am a body, I'm in a body, and objective sense of what it feels like to be inside one of these containers. So that's a little bit about what that word is. So what I wanted to start with was just a history of my own, how I got interested in Zen training, and what it was like, and what has guided me into exploration of body and soma in the way that I do today. So starting from the beginning, when I was, I got interested in Zen training in my, basically midway through college. And I had been, a pretty classic example of up in the head, kind of an intellectual growing up. And, school was my thing, science was my thing, and understanding the world from that cognitive perspective, very left-brained thinker, and but also very interested in how the world worked. So this was my interest. We lose the sound? No, we're good?
A little bit.
Speak up?
A little bit.
Okay. So that was my orientation, very sort of up in the head. And I didn't, so I was around Zen training as a kid through my dad, because my dad was ordained as a priest. He was a Zen master in our Zen tradition, living in Hawaii. And I didn't grow up living there, but in the summers we would travel there and we'd spend some time. And so we were around Zen, but it wasn't something that as kids, my sister and I practiced or participated in. And I thought of it just as, I didn't know much about it. There were some rituals, there were some things, but I didn't know what really gave it meaning, or certainly not for my dad. But when I was about 19 or 20, I got really interested in Well, actually, really what happened is I encountered kind of my own first existential crisis. And thinking back on it, it wasn't so existential, but it felt this way at the time. And what happened for me was being so interested in physics and science, and then encountering, starting to look at some different philosophical traditions, I suddenly got this view that maybe a scientific worldview didn't explain all of the phenomena. That really disturbed me, that maybe not all things could be conceived through this sense of things. And weirdly, this really started to disturb me. And so I asked my dad for advice. I said, hey, what is Zen training about? Like, what kinds of questions does it answer? Why did you do it? Why would one do it? And he gave a pretty simple answer, and he said something along the lines of, well, Zen training is really an exploration of the self and what it means to be alive. And at that time, that really resonated with me. And I thought to myself, yeah, I'm at a crossroads where I have lost some sense of bearing with creating a sense of meaning. And so I interrupted my college trajectory, and I moved to Hawaii, and I decided I was going to take a year off, and I was going to really see if I could understand what this is that way. Early on, so one of the founder of the temple that I belong to and Ken belongs to in Hawaii was a guy who had first studied the martial arts very extensively. Actually, before he was a Zen person and whatnot, his study had been exclusively in the martial arts. That definitely sort of influenced the atmosphere, the training atmosphere. And early on, he was a very interesting guy in the sense that you were either really glad to be in his presence because things felt great and he had a lot of charisma and presence, or you wanted to be like running like several miles away because he was scolding you, or very dynamic teacher with interesting qualities. He was near the end of his life, and so I didn't have a lot of one-on-one time. But at one point, I had an interview with him, and it was the intention for the meeting was about where was I going with my life, and should I go back to school? And I was still in this phase of, well, shoot, science doesn't explain everything. What's going on? And he kind of cut to the core a little bit. Hey, Sharon, and by saying. He said, so what is it that you're really interested in? And I didn't really answer. I didn't have a good answer. He said, you're interested in the meaning of life, aren't you? And I said, yeah, actually, that pretty much captures what I am interested in. He said, well, I'll give you a hint. He said, the meaning of life can be entirely reduced to breath and posture. I thought to myself, I don't think he said it again, but I said it again a few more times in my mind. The meaning of life can be entirely reduced to breath and posture. So I found that really, actually stunning as a phrase. And the reason I found it stunning was because meaning, the word meaning to me is something to do with the brain. Thinking. How could breath and posture, how could that encapsulate life? That was not how I thought of my body at that time. But although I didn't understand what he meant, I believed that he was pointing to something important for me. So I took that as an entry point into starting to explore myself and through embodiment. And the style of training that we do in our tradition is very much oriented in a body-based way. So sitting meditation is sitting and learning to breathe your breath in a particular manner. And the martial arts training, again, very physical. And as a young person at that time, being in my early 20s, besides the martial arts, it was physical in lots of other ways. We did manual labor of all different kinds, building things, moving things. All of that embodiment was considered the foundations of our training. And although I was a physics student and then later a philosophy major, I actually didn't study, almost like it wasn't allowed, the Zen philosophy components. I didn't learn that until probably 5 or 6 years into my, because the attitude was, first we want you to absorb something through your body, and then we'll start to talk about the meaning that's some history on that approach. After I finished college, I did a 3-year monastic staying at the temple. And at the beginning of that, so that was sort of full-time in residence. And at the beginning of that, my senior martial arts teacher, he gave me a belt, and it's called a hata belt. We use it in our style training, and it's just a simple canvas cloth that goes around your waist and supports your lower belly. And hata is the word for lower belly in Japanese. It's big in martial arts and in Zen meditation. So he gave me this hata belt, which I already had one, but he gave me this kind of symbolic. And he said, he had done this 3 years of live-in training, and he said, my suggestion is that you wear this thing 24 hours a day for the whole time that you're living. That this is the closest thing to a Bible that we have. And so I did that. I wore this belt, and except when I was showering, and occasionally I laundered it, hopefully. But the purpose of that is to cultivate awareness of this part of our body. And in the Zen tradition, developing a sense of your breath and a sense of centeredness at this region, your lower belly, is very central to the embodiment piece of the kind of training. So that's just an example of ethos within it. A little bit more history predating my time there. So when our temple was founded in Hawaii in the 1970s, sometime in around the 1990s, a gentleman moved from the United States from the mainland to Honolulu, who had been a Western trained body worker. The guy's name was Dub Lee, and he had studied with both Ida Rolf and Moshe Feldenkrais, two very seminal body workers in the sort of 60s, 70s. And around that time in the US, as sort of part of the countercultural movement and part of this human potential movement coming out of Esalen in California, there's this idea that different ways of exploring the self and personal growth through body-oriented practices. So Rolfing, what Ida Rolf developed, was a deep tissue body approach to body work or massage for these purposes. And Feldenkrais was a movement-based exploration of bodily integration. And then there were some psychologists like Gestalt work and things that were kind of in this overall school. And so he moved to Hawaii, and somebody said, hey, you should meet the Roshi, the guy up at the dojo. He's really interesting. You guys have probably hit it off. And so somebody brought him up there for an interview. Tana Roshi, the same guy who had told me that the meaning of life can be reduced to breath and posture. And the two of them met, and it was an important and influential meeting because what Tanaue Roshi recognized was that a Western-trained person had sort of crossed paths with him that had had sufficient skillfulness working with the body and through himself. And so he, reading his movements, how he was probably speaking, he could see, okay, this guy has a sophisticated sense of embodiment that isn't the norm, coming from this new Western tradition that Tana Roshi had read about. He was interested in that. So he was kind of excited to meet somebody who had that skill set because he himself had a tremendous healing ability, having come out of his intensive martial arts practice and some other kind of esoteric things. Very skilled energy worker, things like that. So the two of them met, and Tana Roshi said, hey, well, okay, show me how you would fix this thing. So maybe somebody has an elbow problem or something. And so Dub would do some stuff, and he'd have the person move and this and that. integrate. And Tanaroshi said, oh yeah, that's pretty good. I like the way that you did that. Well, here, and then somebody else would come and Tanaroshi would say, okay, well, here's how I would do it. And he'd do something and this and that, and then the person's arm. And what Dub was so impressed by was that very often Tanaroshi could do it much, much quicker. And like in a few minutes, what it may take him 15 minutes or 30 minutes. So he asked him, hey, what is that about? What are you doing how does that happen so much faster? And he said, well, you know, what I've learned mostly about, I don't know so much about what's what in terms of the joints, but what I do know a lot about is how energy moves through the body, and I know how to work with that. And coming from an Eastern tradition of the concept of qi and ki, sort of universal energy, very much a part of Eastern medicine and concepts of life overall. And Dub had always been very skeptical of this idea of thinking of energy as, it's kind of woo-woo and people are talking about this, but here was an example where he couldn't really refute some of what he was seeing. So the two worked together and they developed a style of working that used the Rolfing combined with some Feldenkrais work as a foundation from a technique point of view, but then added in some of the Zen development, refinement of breath, concentration, and an understanding of universal energy, or ki, our Chinese qi, as a part of their system of work. And when I began my training, that work, that style of working wasn't really central, but it was around. There were practitioners of it in Honolulu, and we as young martial arts students who were meditating a lot and doing our intensive, we'd get hurt, and we would learn little bits and pieces to kind of keep each other going through stuff. And it was enough for me to think, wow, this is really interesting, sort of some of the experiences that I had in terms of, wow, okay, somebody worked on my hip, and now I'm standing up, and how much clearer I feel mentally. So there was something that resonated in it for me, but it wasn't very simple. And fast forwarding a little bit, a few years, by 2005, we had moved to Wisconsin for the purpose of developing our own branch of Zen practice here. Madison branch had existed with Ken Kushner teaching and archery for several decades. And then my dad and stepmom and myself moved here to Spring Greene and bought a piece of property with the intention of building a residential. What we've been doing over the past about 12 years now, I think. And so I moved here and was heavily involved in that project and was still working mostly with my hands. I had learned some carpentry skills in my residential training. And so I was doing that, building the place, we're doing the woodwork, some of these things. And then a random encounter or a random event happened that really then shifted the course of what I was doing professionally and in my Zen training. And what happened was I received a phone call from a student of that guy, Dub. So Dub was the Western trained guy, and he was very old by the time I met him. So he wasn't sort of active as a teacher. And so you couldn't study with him. But I got a phone call one day, and it was from a guy named Everett, and the guy left a message and he said, "Hey Alex, my name's Everett. You don't know me, but I know your parents. I'm a longtime dojo person, and I haven't connected with your parents in a long time. I live in Chicago. I heard that you folks moved to Wisconsin and are doing some Zen stuff. I'd love to reconnect with your parents. I found you through your website on the internet, and please, here's my phone number, and pass that along to your folks." And nothing about that message is such a big deal, except my reaction to it was. So I heard this message, I listened to it, I probably listened to it a second time, and there was something about the quality of Everett's voice that struck me so much that I thought to myself, I really need to meet this guy. And when I meet him, if he matches up to what I just heard, I'm going to ask him if he takes students for body. This thought came out of nowhere. No part of me had been thinking about studying body work. I had no interest other than some good memories. I was doing totally different stuff. And what it was about his voice was, it was as if, it was coming through my phone, obviously, the sound, but it was as if his entire body was vibrating and coming along for the ride. So the delivery of this sound was his whole body. Very resonant, very deep from his body. And in martial arts, we kind of listen for when somebody does a shout, where's the sound coming from? Low in the belly, or is it getting stuck in the chest or the throat? And there was so much clarity to the sound. Not only that, there was a warmth, and even in his message, he was kind of laughing somehow while he was talking. And so there's this liveliness and this warmth that just made me feel really good. And I thought to myself, wow, that's the kind of body that I would like to be living inside. Impression from this short call. And so I relayed the message, and a few weeks later, so they got in touch with my parents, and then a few weeks later, he traveled up from Chicago to meet, or to see what we were doing at the dojo. And so I knew he was there, so I went over for a visit to meet him, and with the intention of, if it felt that same way when I met him in person, then I was going to ask if he took students. And when I met him, it was really great. He was getting changed to get ready to go meditate. Walked in the door. I said, "Oh, hey, Everett, I'm Alex." And we both just started laughing. That was it. The feeling was like I had known him for like years already. And I said, "I would really like to study bodywork with you. Do you take students?" And he said, "Yeah, we can make that happen." And just like that, that ball got set in motion for me. So that was around 2009. And I had a business at the time doing woodworking and construction and things like that. I had a few employees and things. And an interesting thing happened was every free moment that I had once I started this training process was me driving down to Chicago, doing body work, trading with partners, getting body work, coming back, working on my projects, things like that. Over a several year period where really any spare time I was immersing myself in this work. And what was really driving that? So I just want to capture a little bit about what was happening for me that led that made it connect. And what was happening was that I was observing in myself a lot of shifts and changes, just in the sense of, one, on a level of pain. I had been a carpenter, so I'd gotten some aches and pains and things, and some history with that, which was in some ways what led me into the initial interest. But more than that was, as I was getting this deep work, I was noticing that it was like parts of my personality were waking up and coming alive and becoming part of, sort of who I was in the world. So just little examples would be, like, for example, creative energy. So I might get some session of body work, and then for a several-week period, although I'm not an artistic kind of a person generally, something being touched into that, wow, now suddenly there's this source of creative energy that I need to find some expression of or working with, as one example. As another example would be with clearing out of some grief and some things that I'd experienced. Divorce and some childhood sort of separations and griefs came to the surface in a way that allowed me to work with those. So I connected with parts of my history, I was connecting with parts of my energy, and I was also noticing that my sense of connectedness with other people was changing, and especially my sense of empathy, able to sort of feel in connection with other people. So more easily able to be touched to the point of tears or things of that nature. So I would describe that period as one of just kind of a general somatic opening. I'm going to come back to that word. So my body, through my body, aspects of myself were becoming available that gave me the feeling of being more connected to myself and the world around me. And having had that experience so strongly is what led me into then ultimately leaving my other work behind and diving into doing that work professionally with others. And that itself was its own journey. So I went full-time around 2011, and with this structural integration bodywork approach that and worked on a lot of people, and some of them with experiences similar to what I had had, some very different. Some was only body-oriented stuff, but I got to see a wide range of people and a wide range of phenomenon and get a sense of the wide varieties of things that can happen when we work through the body, and was continuously amazed by things that would happen for other people, the things that I could feel in the room. And so, and that leads me to the next thing that I got really interested in, which was when I was doing in the therapeutic environment, which I was talking with Ben a little bit earlier, he's a chiropractor, sharing that there's, being in the therapeutic context is a really unique relational space, because it's you and another person. And although the centrality of the work is what's happening at that person, for example, let's say we're doing body work, or in Ben's case, the chiropractic manipulation, we'd be moving something or working through tissue or getting something to relax. And so that's all for sure happening. But above and beyond that, there's something that's occurring in the relational space, meaning whether there's touch or not, there's something that's happening because two human beings are sitting together in a shared space and with a shared intention. And as I did more and more work, I became increasingly interested in that aspect. Okay, yes, I got proficient at the techniques, I learned some subtlety, and I got more exposure to more variety, but I got especially interested in, well, what is it that is occurring that's palpable and felt, the sense of shared relationality. And what I started to observe was what would surface for a person in terms of maybe something to let go, or an emotional experience to come through and be worked with in a meaningful way, or a tension pattern to resolve and let go. That the ability of that to happen with the other person was very much in relation to the kind of person that I was being or representing in the space. How I was showing up wasn't neutral or didn't have an impact. It was clearly in connection to what was going to be the outcomes and what was possible for that person. That becomes a very good practice opportunity for you as the practitioner, because you very readily start to learn what is it that can get in the way of therapeutic events and happenings in the person that you're working with. And you become self-conscious of when something in you has interrupted, interfered, prevented some, thing from happening. And so that interest, the interest of that relational space, and also the kinds of things that I was observing for people in terms of, again, emotional connectingness to life history, increased capacity to connect to people in the everyday world, shifts in their anxiety and their depression, things like that, started to lead me in the direction of getting really interested in, well, what do we know about that, those dynamics from a modern point of view, which led me into the last 4 years. My focus has of study. I've continued to do all the same body work, but my new focus of study in the last 4 years has been in trauma therapy, and specifically in body-oriented trauma therapy. So trauma therapy has been around for a long time, and the older models tend to be what we'll separate between what's called a top-down approach to trauma therapy and a bottom-up approach. And top-down is cognitive behavioral therapy or other kinds of talk therapy, which sort of begin at the level of the head with the hope of resolving conflict and distress or PTSD symptoms or history from the past. Excellent work, it does really good things. And then but now in the last 30 years really has been the evolution of what's called bottom-up processing, which is the recognition that much of trauma can be well accessed through the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that controls the state of our body. So things like whether, so then we start to reframe things like anxiety as body-based experiences. So if your heart rate is elevated and your breath is shallow and your arms and hands are tense, well, that can be interpreted through the lens of, well, what's going on? What's governing that is the autonomic nervous system. So I'm not going to go into a ton of theory, although I've gotten very, very interested in the theory of what we know about the autonomic nervous system and the nervous system more broadly in terms of functioning in the body and its connection to what we would consider our mind or our mental life. So when we think about anxiety, many of us would think about that as a mental phenomenon, but I would argue that in many ways it's bodily phenomenon. So that has been kind of the trajectory, and so circling back to the Zen work, what I have come to, this whole series of time as I got into body work up till and now into trauma therapy, leading up till now, I've continued to connect with and participate in our Zen training community in Greene, Wisconsin, and retreats and seminars and things that we do here and in different parts of the world. So I've been lucky to have teaching opportunities in those places. And something that I started to think about was that in our world today, contemporary American culture, and the kinds of lives that we lead and the stresses that we have, we tend to be relatively, I think most of us here can probably agree, there's a lot more forces of stress and hurrying and things that tend to pull us into more anxious states and probably pull us more out of our bodies than at other times in history or certainly other cultures. Widespread use of pharmaceuticals, which are great, but that would contribute to some of our disconnection in that regard. Stresses, always having to be hurrying, the way that we sit and move, artificial spaces that we're in. There's lots of reasons why the body and the nervous system that we're in, that we evolved into, is at odds with the lifestyle and physical environment around us. When we come to Zen training is normally done in pretty controlled environments in a historical sense. So traditionally a monastery might be set in the mountains, and there's nature around. And a common rule of thumb in any kind of Zen experience training or in a monastic environment is that there's a minimum length of time. They won't even accept you as a student if you're not willing to be there for at least 3 weeks, as if you're going to be a residential student. And the reason for that is there's a recognition within Zen training that a certain level of just baseline calming down of your nervous system and of your body is required before what you're trying to do in the meditation experience. It's not even really that relevant if you've got all this noise in your head or physical maladies that are disrupting you. And so what I have been most interested in the last several years, working with a lot of groups of beginner meditators who aren't going to do 3-week residential stays, but they are very interested in what can the practice of Zen training, how can that be real and rich in their lives, and also connect to the kinds of work that they do. A lot of these people are leaders or business leaders or a variety of professions. But again, how to bring the Zen experience into that. And so in my teaching in those workshops, where I have really been led is that the tools of somatic work, the working through the body, working through these ways, is especially relevant as an entry point into Zen training now, given the current sort of lay of the land, our culture and the way we are in our bodies these days. So that's the exploration I've been involved in. I think it's very interesting from a practical point of view, but I also think it's also been really interesting from a theoretical point of view, because on the one hand we have a very ancient technology. I mean, Zen as a practice, I use the word technology very deliberately, as a practice to do something, of trying to create a more regulated and integrated self in a very broad sense of that word, is what I would say Zen practice is oriented towards. And it's doing that with a set of tools, ways to make that happen, that started about 2,000 years ago, without any reference to the nervous system or this or that. Now we have a whole maturing set of practices that began kind of in the Western sense, began in the 1960s and 70s with Rolfing and Feldenkrais and this and that, now yoga, the proliferation of yoga. We now have some Western tools that have really ripened and expanded into the zeitgeist that are actually really relevant starting points as and in conversation with Zen training. And so what I want to do now, if you guys are willing, is I want to shift gears and maybe to actually probably take a few questions right now, but then I want to shift gears and do a little bit of an experiential piece. And the experiential piece I want to do is I want to cover both of those bases. I want to first work with the somatic experiencing, that's a kind of therapeutic work that I do, working with the nervous system. I want to begin with that and do a little bit of an exploration for ourselves. And then I want to segue that into the kind of breathing practice that we do in the Zen tradition as an experiment to see how those two things work together for your guys' bodies and nervous.